Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Gimel and Mirz Hashem. Today we will be learning Daf limud Gimel Amud Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on limud Gimel Amud Beis. In the top line, there are only two lines here in the Shulchan Aruch. Actually, we're starting in the bottom line by the words V'shir Zman Bein Hashmashos. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos, and we've been learning the halacha of Tosfos Shabbos, the halacha that requires one to be Moisef Michael al HaKodesh, both at the beginning of Shabbos and at the end of Shabbos. We have to add on to Shabbos a little bit from the days that would have ordinarily been Chayil. So it's not enough to begin Shabbos when Shabbos actually automatically begins at the very beginning of the Shabbos day at Tzeitzak Echavim Vaday Laila Friday night. Instead, we have to be Mekabel Shabbos a little bit early, and we have to be Moisef Michael al HaKodesh. So too on Motzei Shabbos, we can't run to do Malacha the instant the Shabbos day is over. Instead, we have to extend Shabbos a little bit. We have to be Moisef Michael al HaKodesh. We have to take a little bit of Sunday and attach it to Motzei Shabbos and refrain from doing Malacha for an extra several minutes at least, to be Moisef Michael al HaKodesh. We began yesterday an in-depth discussion. We saw the Mishnah Berurah and the Bir Halacha, the discussion of the famous Machlokes Rabbeinu Tam and the Gra when it comes to Zmanim, how we calculate the times of Bein Hashmashos, Tzeitzak Echavim, Shkia, etc., etc. We're going to continue on that theme today. Our learning should be a schus for Achedu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanasunim, Batzar, Ubashivya, Ha'imdim, Bein Bayam, Bein Bayabasha, Hamakim, Yerachem, Alehem, V'yitziem, Mitzar, L'Rvacha, Me'afelu La'ira, U'mishibed L'Geula, Hashta Bagala, U'vizman Kariv, V'neimar, Amen. So, what we learned in the previous share was the Mechaber said, yes, we have to be Moisef Michael al HaKodesh. Said the Mechaber, this time that you're going to be Moisef from Erev Shabbos on to Shabbos, what time period exactly is that? So we went through the Mishnah Berurah and the Bir Halacha. The Mechaber is going according to the Shitas Rabbeinu Tam. According to Shitas Rabbeinu Tam, the way the Zmanim work, we'll do this very briefly, is as follows. When it comes to Shkia, what's the Shkia? Shkia is sunset, when the sun goes down beneath the horizon. According to Rabbeinu Tam, that is called Techilas Shkia. That is not really sunset, according to the Rabbeinu Tam. That's the Techilas Shkia. It's the beginning of the sunset. But according to Rabbeinu Tam, sunset is actually a very long affair. It begins when the sun goes down under the horizon, but it extends for another 58 and a half minutes until we get to what Rabbeinu Tam calls Soif Shkia, the end of the Shkia. Now, from the Tchilas Shkia until the Soif Shkia, during those 58 and a half minutes, according to Rabbeinu Tam, it's actually Vaday Yom. It's still day. It's still Erev Shabbos during that time period. But when you hit Soif Shkia, 58 and a half minutes after the Tchilas Shkia, now you hit Bein Hashmashos. That's the beginning of Bein Hashmashos. Bein Hashmashos, that's Safek Yom, Safek Laila. How long does Bein Hashmashos last? 13 and a half minutes. So 13 and a half minutes after the Soif HaShkia, that's Tzeitzak Echavim, that's Vaday Laila, that's when Shabbos for certain begins. So now, if we have to do Tosfos Shabbos, when do we do it? Well, it has to be before Tzeitzak Echavim. Tzeitzak Echavim is the actual beginning of Shabbos, whether you Mekabel Shabbos or not. It can't be in the 13 and a half minutes before that, because the 13 and a half minutes before that are not Vaday Yom. Those 13 and a half minutes are Safek Laila. That might already be Shabbos. So you can't be Mekayim Tosfos Shabbos then. When could you be Mekayim Tosfos Shabbos? Before that. The Mechaber said you could be Mekayim Tosfos Shabbos from the Tchilas HaShkia, from the very beginning of Shkia, what we call Shkia, until 58 and a half minutes later by Bein Hashmashos. That's the time period that you have to be Mekayim your obligation of Tosfos Shabbos. And the Mechaber said, how much time do you have to add on to Shabbos to be Mekayim this obligation of Tosfos Shabbos? So the Mechaber said, you want to use that whole 58 and a half minute period? You can. You want to use a little bit of it? You don't have to use all of it. You want to use a little bit of it? You can. The Bir Halacha seems to say that you should use approximately 13 and a half minutes. So like the Mechaber said, between Bein Hashmashos and the time period that you're going to use for Tais Shabbos, you're going to have almost a half an hour, because Ben Hashmashas is 13 and a half minutes. Certainly you can't do Malacha during Ben Hashmashas. Then before that, you need Tais Shabbos, which the Biur Halacha says is also about 13 and a half minutes. So between the two of them, you have 27 minutes. That's what we learned yesterday. Now the Mechaber says as follows. V'shir zman ben hashmashas hu. How long is ben hashmashas? Now we've already covered this really. V'shir zman ben hashmashas hu shloishes rivei mil. It's the time it takes to walk 3/4 of a mil. According to our accepted psak, that a mil is 18 minutes, 3/4 of a mil is 13 and a half minutes. So the Mechaber is telling you, according to Rabbeinu Tam, how long is this period of ben hashmashas? It's 13 and a half minutes. So 13 and a half minutes after the Soif Hashkia, that's when you get Tzeisak HaChavim. So V'shir Zman Ben Hashmashas Hu Shloishes Rivei Mil, Shehe Mahalach Elef V'chamesh Me'os Amos, which is the time it takes to walk 1,500 Amos, which according to our calculations would be 13 and a half minutes, Kaidam Halayla. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah here. It says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Chaf Gimel. How long is Ben Hashmashas? Shloishes Rivei Mil. V'hula erech reva shah, which is approximately 1/4 of an hour. It's 13 and a half minutes. 1/4 of an hour is 15 minutes. 13 and a half minutes, that's Ben Hashmashas. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'hinei HaShulchan Aruch Hizkir b'sif zeh das Rabbeinu Tam. Obviously, the Mechaber over here is accepting the Shita of Rabbeinu Tam, V'siyatoi. Aval harbe mei Rishonim. However, many Rishonim, says the Biur Halacha, Sfira Lahu, they hold, V'gam hagra hiskim l'shitasam, and the Gra agrees with this shita of the Rishonim. Debein hashmashos maschil tekef achad tchilas hashkia. The Gra and these other Rishonim, they hold that Ben Hashmashos starts right after the beginning of Shkia, what we call Shkia. Right after sunset, right after the sun goes down under the horizon and we can no longer see the sun, that begins Ben Hashmashas. As soon as we could no longer see the sun, because it went beneath the horizon, that's the beginning of Ben Hashmashas. And how long is Ben Hashmashas? On that, the Gra doesn't disagree. That's based on the Gemara in Shabbos. How long is Ben Hashmashas? Ben Hashmashas is 13 and a half minutes, 1/4 of a mil. Right after the time period of Ben Hashmashas, that's Tzeisak HaChavim. What's Tzeisak HaChavim? The time when you could see 3 medium stars. And then, it's Vadai Laila L'chol Davar. So again, according to the Gra, you have Shkia. Right away after Shkia begins Ben Hashmashas. Now, Ben Hashmashas is Safek Yom, Safek Laila. So during Ben Hashmashas, you certainly can't do any malacha. And then 13 and a half minutes after Shkia, that's already Tzeisak HaChavim. Tzeisak HaChavim is Vadai Laila. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, Lefizeh, according to this Shita, according to the Shita Sagra, Yesh Lizar Ma'oid, one has to take great care. Shaloi lasis malacha achar sha'achama niskasa b'einenu. That one chas v'chalila should not do any malacha after the sun goes down under the horizon and we can no longer see the sun. One has to be nizar ma'oid not to do any malacha after what we call shkia, because you're already in Ben Hashmashas. Va'afilu maleches mitzvah, even if it's malacha that you want to do for the sake of a mitzvah. Kegoin hadlakas haneres l'suda Shabbos. You have to light neres, so you should be able to have your Friday night Suda. It's pitch black. They didn't have electric light. So you want to light neres so that you should be able to eat the Friday night Suda properly with a lit table. So that's malacha, havara, that you want to do l'tzarech mitzvah and l'tzarech Shabbos. You can't do it Ben Hashmashas. Gam ken yizar ma'oid ligmar hadlakasam kaidim shetishkach hama. You have to make sure that you light those candles before Shkia. Because after Shkia is already Ben Hashmashas. Talacha kain hu b'chlal Ben Hashmashas, according to the Gra. Safek Yom, Safek Laila. You're taking a risk. It could be you're being over Havara Daraisa. It could be it's Mama Shabbos. Va'ayin la'el b'sif katan vav. And he tells us, take a look earlier in this Siman, in Sif katan vav, on Lamed Beis Amid Aleph, 3 lines from the bottom, Mishnah Berurah is katan vav, where the Mishnah Berurah wrote, Bazeh Osir Afilu Tzarech Mitzvah, she is Batal Yedei Zeh Misuda Shabbos Kai Gavda. During Ben Hashmashos, you're not allowed to do malacha, even if it's a tzarech Shabbos and a tzarech mitzvah. This feika daraisahu, because Ben Hashmashos is mamish a suffik daraisa. Va'afilu b'di'eved, the Mishnah Berurah said. Even b'di'eved, you went ahead and you goofed, and you lit the neiris during Ben Hashmashos. Im hidlik oisha asa shar eza malacha Ben Hashmashos asa lehanas mimena. Not allowed to have hana from that malacha. So the Mishnah Berurah is telling you over here, shitas hagra. Again, major difference between the Rabbeinu Tam and the Gra. According to Rabbeinu Tam, what's the status right after Shkia? It's Vadayim. It's not even Ben Hashmashos. Ben Hashmashos doesn't start until 58 and a half minutes after Shkia. Until then, it's Mamish Vadayim, according to Rabbeinu Tam. Ben Hashmashos is 58 and a half minutes after Shkia. 13 and a half minutes later, it's Vaday Laila, it says. But according to the Gra, Ben Hashmashos starts immediately after Shkia. Safek Yom, Safek Laila. You do Malacha, then it's a Safek Daraisa. And Tzeis is only 13 and a half minutes later, at least in Bavel and in Eretz Yisrael. Says the Mishnah Berurah weiter, Ulechatchila, because it is Shitas Agra, Ulechatchila ein lahamtin ad harega ha'achroin. Don't wait until the last minute. Don't wait until Shkia to go light your neiris, etc., etc. Rak yaktabat lakasa mishash hashemish barashay ha'ilanos. You should go ahead and light your candles and do other malacha while the sun is still up near the treetops. Kidlakaman umisha makbar al atzmai. Somebody who is makbar on himself. Upayrish atzmai mi malacha, and he stops. He refrains from doing malacha. Chatzi shah, a half an hour. Ayal kol panim shlisha, or at least a third of an hour, 20 minutes. Kaidim Shkia, before Shkia, Ashrei loy. He's fortunate. Because by refraining from doing malacha already at least 20 minutes before Shkia, he's being yoitza the shitas of all the Rishonim, even the most machmir, Rabbi Elazar Mimitz, who holds that Ben Hashmashos starts 13 and a half minutes, or maybe even 20 minutes before Shkia. So if you refrain from doing malacha 20 minutes before Shkia, you're being yoitza even the most chamer dekeshitas. Or le'inyan motzai Shabbos, and when it comes to Motzai Shabbos, ayin bebir halacha, take a look at the bir halacha shebiyarnu, where we explain b'shem ha'paiskim, in the name of the paiskim, de l'kulei al mahashir de shloishes rivei mil mishtana lefi hazman v'hamakim. This shear, when could you start doing malacha on Motzai Shabbos? The shear of 3/4 of a mil, it depends the time of year and the location on the globe. Because, again, the Gra that says that when the Gemara in Shabbos says that Tzeis is 13 and a half minutes after Shkia, that was for Oifik Bavel and Oifik Eretz Yisrael. But in other places of the globe, and depending on the where you are in the seasons, the short days, the long days, it could be the Tzeis HaKachavim is a lot later. V'lo nemer zeh b'Gemara ela b'Oifik Bavel u'bizman Nisan v'Tishrei she'yom v'halei lo shavim. In our region, says the Mishnah Berurah, where we're in the northern hemisphere, it's a lot longer than 13 and a half minutes after Shkia until you get Vaday Laila. According to Rav Moshe, it takes in the New York area, it's at least 50 minutes, 50. If you want to go by the longest days of the year, so you need, the long days of the year, Shazmaniyos, are very long. So to get to Vaday Laila is going to take longer. So according to Rav Moshe, our position on the globe, the longest days of the year, you have about 50 minutes, 50 minutes after Shkia, until it's Vaday Laila and you could do malacha. Al kein yesh lizar ma'oid shelo lasis malacha b'motzai Shabbos avshen esachar zman rav achar Shkia. Even if it's a long time after Shkia, you should not do malacha yet. Ad sheyero shloisha kechavim ketanim, till you could go outside and you could pinpoint 3 tiny stars. It has to be really dark. Ukidlakaman b'simin reish tzad gimel siv beis v'ayin sham b'Mishnah Berurah ubir halacha. Okay, so the Mechaber said, and again, the Mechaber is going in the world of the Rabbeinu Tam. He said, when does Ben Hashmashos starts? It starts 13 and a half minutes. Koidem halayla. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Koidem halayla. Laila nikri min HaTorah l'chol davar misha yiro shloisha kechavim. Vayin b'bir halacha. Vaday Laila is tzeis hakechavim. Okay, we're going to go a little bit weiter over here. Top line, Lamed Daled Amud Aleph, says the Ramah, Hagah. Now, this Ramah is a very interesting Ramah for us. Many people, especially during this time of the year, they make early Shabbos. What does it mean to make early Shabbos? Well, they daven Mincha before Plag HaMincha, and they finish Mincha at about Plag, and then they daven Kabbalah Shabbos, then Makabel Shabbos, and then they daven Ma'ariv. So they make early Shabbos. They're making Shabbos before Shkia. They're making Shabbos a long time before Tzeis HaKechavim. They're making it a long time before Ben Hashmashis. They're being Makabel Shabbos even before Shkia. But they're being Makabel Shabbos after Plag HaMincha. Now, before we go weiter, let's just explain what Plag HaMincha is. The words literally mean half of Mincha. Now, what's Mincha referring to? Well, we know, famous Gemara in Brachos, we daven Shmoneh Esrei 3 times a day. We daven Shacharis, Keneged the Tamid Shel Shachar, and the Beis Hamikdash every day they brought 2 karbanos timidim. They brought the carbon tamid of the morning, and we daven Mincha Keneged the Tamid Shel Bein Harabayim, the afternoon carbon tamid. We daven Ma'ariv Keneged the burning of the Evarim that were on the Mizbeach. That's when they finished burning all of the limbs and the chalavim, the fats, the emurim that were on the Mizbeach. That was done during the night, so we daven Ma'ariv Keneged that. Now, the Zman for Mincha, since Mincha goes after the Tamid Shel Bein Harabayim, we want to daven Mincha during the time period that the carbon Tamid Shel Bein Harabayim was brought. When was the carbon Tamid Shel Bein Harabayim brought? So the earliest that you could bring the carbon Tamid Shel Bein Harabayim was a half an hour after Chatzos. We like to use the model of a perfect day where you have a 12-hour day. The day starts at 6 a.m. and the day ends at 6 p.m. You're allowed to bring the carbon tamid 6.5 hours into the day, aka, in our case, our example, 12:30, a half an hour after Chatzos. That's when you're allowed to bring the Tamid Shel Bein Harabayim. Since that's when you're allowed to bring the Tamid Shel Bein Harabayim, that's also the earliest that you're allowed to daven Mincha. That Zman is called Mincha Gedola, the large Mincha. Why is it called Mincha Gedola? Because the greatest amount of time that you have to bring the Tamid Shel Bein Harabayim, and therefore to daven Mincha, would be from a half an hour after Chatzos until Shkia. So that gives you a lot of time. You have 11.5 hours over there. So that's Mincha Gedola. However, the truth is that the carbon Tamid was usually not brought so early. The basic reason the carbon tamid wasn't brought so early, I mean, usually we know the reason magdim and lemitzvahs, when we have a mitzvah, we try to do it as soon as humanly possible, but the carbon tamid was not generally brought at Mincha Gedola. Why? Because there's a catch, and that is, all of the karbanos that were brought in the Beis Hamikdash had to be brought between the bringing of the Tamid Shel Shachar and the bringing of the Tamid Shel Bein Harabayim. The very first carbon that had to be brought on the Mizbeach every day was the Tamid Shel Shachar, and the last carbon to be brought on the Mizbeach every day was the Tamid Shel Bein Harabayim. So all the other karbanos had to be put in between the Tamid Shel Shachar and the Tamid Shel Bein Harabayim. Now sometimes you have a lot of karbanos that had to be brought. So it was not practicable to bring the carbon tamid by Mincha Gedola. So Chazal wa Mesakin, when did they generally speaking bring the Tamid Shel Bein Harabayim? They brought it 9.5 hours into the day. 9.5 hours into the day is 2.5 hours before Shkia. This Zman, 9.5 hours into the day, is what we call Mincha Ketana, the small Mincha, because now you're cutting the window that you have between Mincha Ketana and Shkia, right? You're cutting that Zman down. Now you only have 2.5 hours. If you're allowing Mincha from Mincha Gedola until Shkia, you have a lot of time. When we talk about Mincha Ketana, there's very little time. Not very little, but 2.5 hours from Mincha Ketana until Shkia. So that's Mincha Gedola, and that's Mincha Ketana. What's Plag HaMincha? Plag HaMincha means half of the Mincha, which means half of the time between Mincha Ketana and the end of the Zman HaMincha, which is Shkia. So what's that? If you take 2.5 and you cut it in half, you have 1 hour and 15 minutes. So Plag HaMincha, we're going to see, is 1 hour and 15 minutes before Shkia. Okay, now let's see this Ramah. Top line, Lamed Daled Amud Aleph, says the Ramah. Hagah. V'im roitza lahakdim ulakabel olav Shabbos. If you want to make Shabbos early, so we were talking until now about your obligation of Tosefes Shabbos. And the Mechaber told us, when could you fulfill your obligation of Tosefes Shabbos? The Mechaber said, could you just make Shabbos as early as you want? Could you be Mekabel Shabbos 11 o'clock in the morning, Erev Shabbos? The Mechaber said, no. Your window of opportunity for Tosefes Shabbos begins at the Tchilas HaShkia, according to the Rabbeinu Tam, what we call Shkia. That's when you're to the time that you could start. The earliest you could be Mekayim Tosefes Shabbos is at Shkia, and you have 58 and a half minutes, according to the Rabbeinu Tam, until Ben Hashmoshes. That's when you could be Mekabel Shabbos and be Mekayim Tosefes Shabbos. Says the Ramah, if you want to be Mekabel Shabbos as early as you can, how early could you do it? Says the Ramah, V'im roitza lahakdim l'kabel olav Shabbos mikplag hamincha ve'elech. You could do it from plag hamincha and earlier. When's plag hamincha? An hour and 15 minutes earlier. Harishus biyada. You have rishus to do this. Now, we're going to get a little complex over here. Is the Ramah arguing on the Mechaber? The Ramah seems to be following the Mechaber. So the Ramah is also talking in the language of Rabbeinu Tam. Now, you know, if you take a look, where is it? If you take a look, you know what? Before we go weiter, let's just jump right away into Mishnah Berurah is Katan Chavei. Harishus biyadai. The Ramah is saying if you want to be Mekabel Shabbos by Plag HaMincha, Harishus biyadai, you're allowed to. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'nesar ba'asiyas malacha. If you're Mekabel Shabbos after Plag HaMincha, you become Osir and Asiyas Malacha. You're not allowed to do Malacha anymore. Avalim Kibel Olav Shabbos Koidim Plag HaMincha. But if you're Mekabel Shabbos earlier than Plag HaMincha, says the Mishnah Berurah, Ein B'Kabbalah Klum. You try to be Mekabel Shabbos 11 o'clock in the morning, Friday morning, it's worthless. Mekabel Shabbos. No, you're not. You're allowed to do any Malacha that you want. It's not effective. It's not efficacious. Kabbalah Shabbos before Plag HaMincha is meaningless. After Plag HaMincha, it works. And now you're Osir in Asiyas Malacha. Break here for a second. Take a look at Bir Halacha, Dibur HaMaschel Mi Plag. Very important Bir Halacha. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Ayin B'Pri Megadim, take a look at the Pri Megadim Shekasav, who writes, Demisha Mekabel Shabbos B'Soicha Arba Milin. Somebody who's Mekabel Shabbos during the 72 minutes. What 72 minutes? The Rabbeinu Tam's 72 minutes. From Shkia until the Rabbeinu Tam's Tzeis. 72 minutes later. Says the Pri Megadim, someone is Mekabel Shabbos during those 72 minutes, Hu Daraisa. That's a Kabbalah Shabbos Daraisa. Your Mekabel Shabbos after Shkia, so now your Kabbalah Shabbos is a bona fide Daraisa Kabbalah Shabbos. Uba Asei de Tosefes Shabbos. But if you do Malacha, it's not Chorus, it's not a Lav. This we learned yesterday. Tosefes Shabbos is only a Mitzasei. So again, in the world of the Rabbeinu Tam, beginning with the Tchilas HaShkia, yes, that's the Zman of Tosefes Shabbos. Yes, you could be Mekabel Shabbos. If you're Mekabel Shabbos, it's a Daraisa Dika Kabbalah Shabbos, but it's only an Aseh of Tosefes Shabbos during those 72 minutes. Umin Azman Hazeh at Plag HaMincha hu rak b'darabanan. But if you back up before Shkia, during the time of Plag HaMincha, that Kabbalah Shabbos is only a Darabanan. It's not even Daraisa. It's only Darabanan. So that's a very important Bir Halacha. Now, let's go back to Mishnah Berurah's Katan Chavei. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is going to define Plag HaMincha. Plag HaMincha nikra sha'u revia koidem ha'erev. Plag HaMincha is called an hour and 15 minutes before night. We're going to have to figure out what that means. Remember, we're talking about choice. We're talking about proportional hours, the Hainu, which means whether we're talking about long summer days or short winter days, we divide the day evenly into 12 portions, and each one of those becomes a shazmanius. And an hour and 15 minutes before night is Plag HaMincha. Gam kasav dusham diyeshtes ben apaiskim mishar reviahu kaidam ashkia ay kaidam seisakei chavim. Notice that what the Chavetz Chaim said is, what's Plag HaMincha? It's an hour and a quarter koidem ha'erev, before evening. Well, what's evening? Is evening shkia or is evening teis? How do we figure out when Plag HaMincha is? Al keil inyanenu b'di'evid im kibel alatzman l'shem tesef v'shabbos at sha'u revia shekoidem hashkia yesh lahachmir shaloi lasois malacha. So this Ramah, when the Ramah says over here that if you want to be Makabel Shabbos, you could be Makabel Shabbos beginning Plag HaMincha. What exactly is the Ramah saying? The Ramah seems to be following the lead of the Mechaber, talking the language of Rabbeinu Tam. Now, Plag HaMincha is an hour and a quarter before Erev. But what does that mean, according to Rabbeinu Tam? Does that mean, is it an hour and a quarter before Tzeis? Well, if it's an hour and a quarter before Tzeis, that means 75 minutes before Tzeis. Now, let's remember, according to Rabbeinu Tam, Tzeis is 72 minutes after Tchilas HaShkia, after what we call Shkia. So the Mechaber said, what's the Zman of Tais V'Shabbos? The Zman of Tais V'Shabbos begins at Tchilas HaShkia, a.k.a. 72 minutes before Tzeis. Comes the Ramah, and the Ramah says, you could actually be Makabel Shabbos a few minutes earlier. You could do it 75 minutes before Tzeis, which is only 3 minutes longer than the Mechaber. Now, if you learn the Ramah that way, then the Ramah is not really being cholik on the Mechaber. It would then make sense why the Ramah doesn't say anything like Yesh Oimrim, that you could be Makabel Shabbos already by Plag HaMincha, because there's only a 3-minute difference between the Mechaber and the Ramah. Or it could be, you see, this is also a Veltz Machloikis. We always refer to this Machloikis as the Magen Avram and the Gra. How do we calculate Zmanim? When we want to figure out how long Shazmaniyos are, how do we measure the day? Do we measure the day from Netz, which is sunrise, until Shkia, which is sunset? Or do we measure the day from Alois, from dawn, which is before Netz, until Tzeis HaKechavim, which is after Shkia? Obviously, if you go with Alois to Tzeis HaKechavim, you have more time, so Shozmanias are going to be earlier. If you go from Netz to Shkia, the day is going to be shorter. The Shozmanias are going to be shorter. This is why we always have these two different Zmanim. We have Zman Kriya Shema according to the Gra, which is going to be later. We have Zman Kriya Shema according to Magen Avram, which is going to be earlier. That's the root of all of these Sveikis over here. And that's what the Mishnah Berurah is alluding to over here. And that's why the Mishnah Berurah says over here, for sure, b'di'eved, if you're Makabel Shabbos an hour and 15 minutes before Shkia, so according to many, you're already within the time period that you can be Makabel Shabbos. Again, the question is, could you be Makabel Shabbos from Plag HaMincha, meaning an hour and 50 minutes before Shkia? Or could you be Makabel Shabbos an hour and 15 minutes before Tzeis, which is later? This is the question over here. And we see the Bir Halacha brings down for the Pri Begadim. In any case, when you're Makabel Shabbos after Plag but before Shkia, it's only D'Rabbanan. So just to give you a little window, this is all very complex and beyond the scope really of what we do over here. But just to give you a little window of understanding, there are those who are makpid not to make what we call early Shabbos. One of the reasons there are people that are makpid not to make early Shabbos is because you get into a very interesting suffix. Let's say you're Makabel Shabbos after Plag. You make early Shabbos, you're Makabel Shabbos after Plag. Well, the Bir Halacha just brought down from the Pri Megadim that Kabbalah Shabbos is only effective midrabanan. Okay, so you were Makabel Shabbos midrabanan. Now you come home and you sit down to your Friday night suda and you make Kiddush. Kiddush is a Chiyav Daraisa. How are you being Makayim your Chiyav of Kiddush, which is a Chiyav Daraisa, during a time period when it's only Shabbos midrabanan because it's not yet Shkia? So this is where things get a little bit murky. But in any case, that's where we're going to stop here for today. So again, a little bit deeper of an understanding into the famous Machlokes, the Rabbeinu Tam and the Gra. We begin to understand Taisvei Shabbos, early Shabbos. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe should said, Yeshua Sefuras Panasa Cheduchim Tol Those in need. We should be zeichet to see the Bias Gal Tzedek B'Meher V'Yameinu Amen. Be well.